The sun had bled its last crimson drops across the horizon when I heard it, a sound that cut through the evening stillness like a knife through silence. At first I thought it might be a wounded animal, maybe a coyote caught in a trap, but as I guided my weathered horse closer to the abandoned Mitchell Ranch, the sound became unmistakably human. A child's cry, weak and desperate. I had been riding this same trail for 3 years now, ever since I'd settled in the dying prairie town of Cedar Falls. At 43, I'd grown accustomed to solitude, preferring the company of my horse and the vast emptiness of the plains to the suspicious glances and whispered conversations that followed me wherever I went. People in small towns had long memories, and my past wasn't the kind that earned invitations to Sunday dinners. The crying grew louder as I dismounted near the rotting fence posts that marked what used to be the Mitchell property. Old Man Mitchell had died 2 winters ago, leaving behind nothing but debts and a ranch that nobody wanted to buy. The place had become a haven for drifters and outlaws passing through, which was exactly why I avoided it after dark. But tonight was different. Tonight something was pulling me forward against every instinct that told me to ride away. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick, and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story." Behind the main house, partially hidden by overgrown weeds and fallen timber, I saw a sight that stopped my heart cold. A small figure, no bigger than a rag doll, was tied to a splintered fence post. The child couldn't have been more than 2 years old, his tiny frame shaking with exhaustion and fear. Dirt and tears had created muddy streaks down his cheeks, and his clothes, what little remained of them, hung in tatters. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, dropping to my knees beside the boy. My hands trembled as I worked to untie the rough rope that bound the child's wrists. The knots were tight, cruel, tied by someone who had no intention of this boy ever getting free. The toddler looked up at me with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young, eyes that had seen things no child should ever witness. When I finally freed him, the boy didn't run or cry out. Instead, he clutched something tightly in his small fist, a tattered handkerchief with delicate embroidery that spelled out a single letter, S. "Where's your mama, little one?" I asked softly, though I knew the child was too young to answer. The boy just stared at me, those haunting eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and terror. I had seen plenty of cruelty in my 43 years. I'd witnessed men kill for a handful of coins and watched families torn apart by greed and violence. But this was something that reached into the deepest, darkest corners of my soul and twisted everything I thought I knew about human nature. As I lifted the child into my arms, memories of my own childhood came flooding back. I remembered being 8 years old, hiding in a root cellar while my father's creditors ransacked our home. I remembered the hunger, the cold, the overwhelming sense of abandonment that had shaped every decision I'd made since. This boy would not suffer the same fate, not if I had anything to say about it. The ride back to my cabin seemed to take forever. The child had fallen asleep against my chest, exhausted from whatever ordeal had brought him to that fence post. I could feel the boy's ribs through his thin shirt, could see the signs of prolonged hunger and neglect. Whoever had done this had been planning it for some time. My cabin sat on a small piece of land I'd bought with money earned from odd jobs and the occasional bounty. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a stone fireplace. But it was honest work that had paid for it, and it was the first place I'd ever been able to call home. Inside, I laid the boy on my own bed and began the delicate process of cleaning him up. The child woke several times during the process, each time gripping that embroidered handkerchief tighter, as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the world. "S," I said quietly, studying the careful stitching. "That's your mama's initial, isn't it?" The boy's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time I saw something other than fear in them. Recognition, hope. I warmed some milk over the fire and tried to coax the child to drink. It took patience. The boy was clearly traumatized and suspicious of any kindness. But eventually, I managed to get some nourishment into him. As the night wore on, I found myself humming old lullabies my own mother had sung to me before she died, songs I hadn't thought about in decades. By morning, word of my discovery had somehow reached town. I wasn't surprised. Secrets had a way of traveling fast in places like Cedar Falls, especially when they involved the local outcast. What did surprise me was how quickly the accusations started flying. Sheriff Williams arrived just after sunrise, his face grim and his hand resting on his gun belt. Behind him stood Mayor Thompson and Doc Harrison, both men I recognized but had never spoken to directly. "Jaxon," the sheriff said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and suspicion. "We heard you found yourself a child last night." "Found him tied to a post out at the old Mitchell place," I replied, stepping protectively in front of my cabin door. "Someone left him there to die." "That's a serious accusation," Mayor Thompson interjected. "You got any proof of that?" My jaw tightened. "The rope burns on his wrists are proof enough. The fact that he was half-starved and scared out of his mind is proof enough." "Could be you put those rope burns there yourself," Sheriff Williams said quietly. "Could be you're the one who's been keeping this child, and now you're trying to cover your tracks." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I'd expected suspicion. It followed me everywhere. But this was different. This was about an innocent child, and the implication that I could harm something so helpless made my blood boil. "You know me better than that, Williams," I said, my voice dangerously low. "Do I?" the sheriff replied. "All I know is that you're a man with a past you don't talk about, living alone out here with no family, no friends, no ties to this community. And now suddenly you've got a child that nobody's claimed." Doc Harrison stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "Let me examine the boy, Jaxon. If what you're saying is true, there'll be evidence." I hesitated. I'd grown attached to the child in just one night, felt a protective instinct I hadn't experienced since never. The thought of handing him over to these men, even temporarily, made every muscle in my body tense. But I also knew that refusing would only make me look more guilty. Reluctantly, I stepped aside and allowed the doctor to enter my cabin. The examination took 20 minutes. When Doc Harrison emerged, his face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. "Rope burns, just like Jaxon said," the doctor announced. "Recent ones, and signs of prolonged malnutrition and dehydration. This child has been through hell." Sheriff Williams's expression softened slightly, but his hand remained on his gun. "That still doesn't explain how Jaxon happened to find him, or why he didn't bring him to town immediately." "Because I knew this would happen," I said, gesturing to the small crowd that had gathered. "I knew you'd all assume the worst about me, just like you always do." "The boy needs proper care," Mayor Thompson said. "Medical attention, a proper family. You can't provide that, Jaxon." "I can provide safety," I replied firmly. "I can provide someone who gives a damn about what happens to him." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of a new voice, one that changed everything. "That's my boy." Everyone turned to see a man stumbling toward us, his clothes torn and bloody, his face bearing the unmistakable signs of recent violence. He was tall and lean, with the calloused hands of a working man and eyes that held the same haunted quality as the child's. "That's my son," the man repeated, his voice breaking. "His name is Billy Stone." Sheriff Williams drew his gun. "And who might you be?" "Daniel Stone," the man replied, swaying on his feet. "I worked for the Henderson Ranch. That's my boy you found." I felt the world shift beneath my feet. After a night of bonding with the child, of feeling something I'd thought was dead inside me come back to life, the reality of the situation hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't my child to protect. This wasn't my chance at redemption. But as Daniel Stone collapsed to his knees, blood seeping through his shirt, I realized that the story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Daniel Stone's collapse sent the small crowd into chaos. Doc Harrison immediately rushed to his side, while Sheriff Williams kept his gun trained on the wounded man, unsure whether he was looking at a victim or a perpetrator. Don't let them take him," Daniel gasped, his eyes fixed on me. "They'll kill him, kill us all." Who? I demanded, kneeling beside the injured man. Who's trying to kill you? But Daniel had lost consciousness, blood pooling beneath him in the morning dust. Doc Harrison worked frantically to stabilize him, while Mayor Thompson paced nervously, clearly out of his depth. "We need to get him to my office," the doctor said. "He's lost a lot of blood, and there's something lodged in his shoulder. Looks like a bullet fragment." As they prepared to move Daniel, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The man's left hand bore the same rope burns as his son's wrists. Whatever had happened to little Billy, his father had tried to prevent it and had paid a terrible price. "Sheriff," I said quietly, "this man didn't abandon his child. Someone took the boy from him." Williams's expression remained skeptical. "That's a hell of an assumption, Jaxon. Look at his hands. Look at the wounds. This man fought for his son." The sheriff examined Daniel's injuries more closely, and I saw doubt creep into his eyes. The rope burns, the defensive wounds on his arms, the bullet fragment. It all painted a picture of a man who had been overpowered, not one who had willingly given up his child. "All right," William said finally. "We'll take him to Doc's place and see what he has to say when he wakes up. But the boy stays in town until we sort this out." "No," the word came out of my mouth before I could stop it. "The boy stays with me." "Jaxon, think about it," the sheriff said. "If someone was willing to shoot this man and tie his child to a fence post, what makes you think they won't try again? At least out here, I can see them coming." It was a weak argument, and everyone knew it. But there was something in my voice, a conviction that surprised even me, that gave Williams pause. 24 hours, the sheriff said finally. "You keep the boy for 24 hours while we figure out what happened. But if I don't like what I hear from Daniel Stone, I'm coming back with a warrant." As the crowd dispersed, I found myself alone with Billy once again. The child had slept through most of the commotion, exhausted from his ordeal, but now he was awake and looking around with those two knowing eyes. "Your daddy's hurt, little man," I said softly, "but he's going to be okay. Doc Harrison's taking good care of him." Billy clutched his embroidered handkerchief tighter, and I noticed for the first time that there were other letters stitched into the fabric, faded and worn, but still visible. S-A-R-A-H. "Sarah," I whispered. "That's your mama's name, isn't it?" The boy's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. His face crumpled, and he began to cry. Not the desperate wails of the night before, but the quiet, hopeless sobs of a child who had lost everything. I spent the rest of the morning trying to comfort Billy while my mind raced with questions. Where was Sarah Stone? Why had Daniel been shot? And who was powerful enough to make a man abandon his family in the middle of nowhere? The answers began to come that afternoon when I decided to do some investigating of my own. Leaving Billy in the care of Mrs. Cooper, the only person in town who had shown any kindness toward me, I rode out to the Henderson Ranch where Daniel supposedly worked. What I found there only deepened the mystery. The ranch was in chaos. Cattle were scattered across the range, fences were down, and the main house showed signs of recent violence, broken windows, overturned furniture, and bloodstains on the front porch. "Hello," I called out, my hand resting on my gun. "Anyone here?" A voice answered from the barn, weak, frightened, but unmistakably female. "Help, please!" I found her in one of the stalls, bound and gagged, her clothes torn and her face bruised. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and eyes that held the same desperate quality I'd seen in Billy's face. "Sarah?" I asked as I cut her bonds. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Billy! Where's Billy? They said they'd kill him if Daniel didn't—" "He's safe," I assured her. "Your husband found me. He's hurt, but he's alive." The relief that washed over Sarah's face was profound, but it was quickly replaced by terror. "We have to get out of here," she said, struggling to stand. "They'll be back soon. They always come back." Who's doing this to you?" "Marcus Blackwood," she whispered, the name carrying the weight of a curse. "He says Daniel owes him money, but it's not true. Daniel never borrowed anything from him. Blackwood just wants our land, the water rights." I knew the name. Marcus Blackwood was a loan shark and land grabber who operated out of the county seat, using violence and intimidation to build his empire. If Blackwood was involved, it explained everything: the desperation, the violence, the willingness to use a child as leverage. "How long has this been going on?" I asked as I helped Sarah toward my horse. 3 months, she replied. "Ever since Daniel inherited his father's property." Blackwood showed up with papers claiming Daniel owed him $5,000, money his father supposedly borrowed before he died. But Daniel's father never borrowed money from anyone. He was too proud. "Did you go to the sheriff?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Sheriff Williams won't cross Blackwood. Nobody will. He owns half the county, and the other half is too scared to stand up to him." As we rode back toward town, Sarah told me the rest of the story. Blackwood had given Daniel 30 days to pay the alleged debt. When Daniel couldn't produce money he didn't owe, Blackwood's men had attacked the ranch. Daniel had managed to get Sarah and Billy away, but they'd been pursued. In the chaos, Billy had been captured. "Daniel tried to trade himself for Billy," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "But Blackwood's men just laughed. They said they'd keep the boy as insurance, make sure Daniel didn't try to run or go to the law. So Daniel came looking for his son and found him tied to that fence post like an animal." Sarah's voice was filled with rage and heartbreak. "What kind of monsters do that to a baby?" I didn't answer, but I knew exactly what kind of monsters we were dealing with. I'd encountered men like Blackwood before. Men who saw other people as nothing more than obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. The fact that they'd been willing to use a toddler as leverage told me everything I needed to know about their character. By the time we reached town, the sun was setting and I could see smoke rising from the chimney of Doc Harrison's office. Daniel was awake and, according to Mrs. Cooper, he'd been asking for his wife and son non-stop. The reunion was everything I had hoped it would be and everything I'd feared it would cost me. Watching Sarah and Daniel hold their son, seeing the pure joy and relief on their faces, I felt a happiness that was almost painful in its intensity. This was what family looked like. This was what love looked like. And it was something I would never have. But as the Stone family clung to each other in Doc Harrison's office, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. Through the window, I could see riders approaching town, 6 men in dark coats, moving with the purposeful stride of those who had come to finish what they'd started. Marcus Blackwood had arrived to collect his debt. The riders came like harbingers of death, their horses' hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth as they rode down Cedar Falls' main street. I recognized the type immediately. Hired guns with cold eyes and steady hands, men who killed for money and slept soundly afterward. Leading them was a figure I had heard described but never seen. Marcus Blackwood himself, tall and lean with silver hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty that twisted his features. Blackwood carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. "Doc," I said quietly, moving to the window of the medical office, "you might want to keep the Stones in the back room." Dr. Harrison looked up from checking Daniel's bandages, saw the riders, and immediately understood. "Sarah, take Billy and Daniel into the supply room. Don't come out until I tell you." But Daniel struggled to sit up, his face pale but determined. "No, I won't hide from him anymore." "Daniel," Sarah began. "He's got my son once," Daniel said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'll die before I let him take Billy again." I admired the man's courage, but courage without strategy was just another word for suicide. "Daniel, you're in no condition to fight. Let me handle this." "This isn't your fight, Jaxon. It became my fight the moment I found your boy tied to that fence post." The truth was, I had been looking for a fight like this my entire life. A fight where the lines were clearly drawn, where I could stand on the side of right without question or doubt. For too long, I'd been running from my past, from the violence that seemed to follow me wherever I went. But this time, the violence had a purpose. Sheriff Williams appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Blackwood's here," he announced unnecessarily. "He's asking about the Stone family." "And what did you tell him?" I asked. Williams' silence was answer enough. The sheriff was a decent man, but he was also a practical one. He wouldn't stand against Blackwood without overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing, and even then he'd think twice. I told him I'd look into it, Williams said finally. But Jaxon, you need to understand. Blackwood's got legal papers. As far as the law's concerned, Daniel owes him money. Forged papers, Sarah said from the doorway, ignoring her husband's attempts to keep her hidden. Those documents are fake, and everyone knows it. Knowing it and proving it are two different things, Williams replied. And until someone can prove those papers are forged, my hands are tied. I felt the familiar rage building in my chest. The same anger that had driven me to leave my last town and the one before that. But this time I forced myself to think clearly. Blackwood was smart. He wouldn't have come to town without a plan. The question was, what did he really want? The answer came sooner than expected. Blackwood himself appeared in the doorway, flanked by two of his men. Up close, he was even more intimidating. Not because of his size, but because of the absolute confidence in his bearing. This was a man who had never lost, and he knew it. "Sheriff Williams," Blackwood said, his voice cultured and polite. "I understand you've recovered some stolen property of mine." "I'm not sure what you mean," Williams replied carefully. Blackwood's eyes found Daniel, then moved to Sarah and Billy, the Stone family. "They've been hiding from their legal obligations, Sheriff. I have a court order demanding payment of a legitimate debt, and when they couldn't pay, they fled in the night." "That's a lie," Daniel said, struggling to his feet despite his injuries. "I never borrowed money from you, Blackwood. My father never borrowed money from you." "Your father was a gambling man, Daniel," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Perhaps he didn't share all his business dealings with you." I watched the exchange with growing understanding. Blackwood wasn't just here for money, he was here for the land. The Stone property sat on one of the few reliable water sources in the county, and in a drought year like this one, water was worth more than gold. "What's the real game here, Blackwood?" I asked, stepping forward. "Because we both know this isn't about a debt." Blackwood's attention shifted to me, and for the first time, his composure slipped slightly. "And you are?" "Someone who doesn't like seeing children used as leverage." "Ah, yes, the mysterious Mr. Jaxon. I've heard about you." Blackwood's smile was cold. "A man with a violent past, living alone, no family, no ties to this community. Some might wonder what your interest is in the Stone family." The implication was clear, and I felt my temper flare. But before I could respond, little Billy broke free from his mother's arms and ran straight to me, wrapping his tiny arms around my legs. The gesture was simple, innocent, and devastating. In that moment, everyone in the room could see the bond that had formed between the lonely cowboy and the traumatized child. It was pure, uncomplicated, and absolutely genuine. Blackwood's expression darkened. "Touching," he said, "but irrelevant. I have legal papers, Sheriff. I want what's owed to me." "And if they can't pay," Williams asked, "then I'll take the land in compensation. It's all perfectly legal." "Over my dead body," Daniel said. Blackwood's smile returned. "That can be arranged." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. I felt Billy's grip tighten on my legs, felt the child's fear radiating through the small room. This had gone far enough. "There's another option," I said quietly. Everyone turned to look at me. "What kind of option?" Blackwood asked. "A contest. You and me, winner takes all." Blackwood laughed. "What are you, 12 years old? This is the real world, not some dime novel." "You're right," I agreed. "In the real world, men like you hide behind hired guns and forged papers. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone calls your bluff." The insult hit its mark. I could see Blackwood's jaw tighten, could see the anger building behind his eyes. Men like Blackwood had one weakness: their pride. They couldn't stand to be challenged, especially in public. "What did you have in mind?" Blackwood asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Simple. You and me. Tomorrow at dawn. Guns. If I win, you tear up those papers and leave the Stones alone. If you win, you get the land, and I'll throw in my property as a bonus." "Jaxon, no," Sarah whispered. "You don't understand what you're up against." But I did understand. I understood that Blackwood was a bully who had never faced real opposition. I understood that men like him were cowards at heart, used to winning through intimidation rather than skill. And I understood that sometimes the only way to stop a monster was to become something more dangerous. Interesting proposition, Blackwood said. But why would I risk everything on a gunfight when I can simply take what I want through legal means? Because you're curious, I replied. You want to know if the stories about me are true. You want to know if the man who cleaned out the Raven Creek gang single-handed is still as fast as they say. The room went dead silent. I had never spoken about my past in Cedar Falls, had never given anyone reason to connect me with the events that had made me famous and infamous across 3 states. But now, with Billy's life hanging in the balance, I was willing to use that reputation. Blackwood's eyes widened slightly. You're that Jaxon? Jaxon Cross? I'm that Jaxon, I confirmed. And I'm making you an offer. Take it, or spend the rest of your life wondering if you were fast enough. The challenge was irresistible, and we both knew it. Blackwood had built his reputation on being the most dangerous man in the county. The chance to prove himself against a genuine legend was too tempting to pass up. Dawn, Blackwood said finally. Main Street. And when I kill you, I'm taking the stone land and everything else you own. Fair enough, I replied. But when I kill you, your men ride out of here and never come back. Blackwood nodded curtly and turned to leave, his men following. But at the doorway, he paused. You know, Cross, I've always wondered what happened to you after the Raven Creek business. Some said you'd gone soft, living the quiet life. I guess we'll find out tomorrow, I said. After Blackwood left, the room erupted in voices. Williams warning me about the legal ramifications, Doc Harrison questioning my sanity, Sarah begging me to reconsider. But through it all, I was aware of only one thing, Billy's small hand slipping into mine, trusting and warm. That night, as I sat by my fireplace cleaning my guns, Daniel Stone appeared at my door. The injured man moved slowly, but his eyes were clear and determined. I can't let you do this, Daniel said. This is my fight. You're in no condition to fight anyone, I replied. Besides, I've been looking for a reason to use these guns for something good. Might as well be now. Why? Daniel asked. Why risk your life for people you barely know? I was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. Because that boy deserves a chance to grow up with his family. Because his mother deserves to sleep without fear. And because sometimes a man has to stand up for what's right, even if it costs him everything. And if you lose? I smiled grimly. Then I guess I'll finally get some peace. But as I said the words, I realized they weren't true anymore. For the first time in years, I didn't want peace. I wanted to live. I wanted to see Billy grow up, wanted to help rebuild the family that had been torn apart by greed and violence. I wanted a chance at redemption. Tomorrow at dawn, I would either claim that chance or die trying. The morning mist clung to Cedar Falls Main Street like the breath of ghosts, swirling around the wooden storefronts and hitching posts as the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon. I stood at the far end of the street, my long coat hanging open to reveal the twin Colts at my hips, weapons that had made me famous and infamous in equal measure. At the opposite end, Marcus Blackwood waited with the patience of a predator. He'd shed his expensive coat for a simple black vest, and his gun belt sat low on his hips in the manner of a man who knew how to use it. Between us stretched 50 yards of packed earth that would soon be stained with blood. The entire town had turned out to witness the confrontation. They lined the boardwalks and peered from windows, drawn by the same morbid fascination that made men slow their horses to stare at roadside graves. Sheriff Williams stood to one side, his hand resting on his gun, ready to intervene if the fight spilled over into something larger. But my attention was focused on a small group standing in front of Doc Harrison's office. Daniel Stone, pale but upright, had his arm around his wife, Sarah. Between them stood little Billy, clutching his embroidered handkerchief and staring at me with those two knowing eyes. The boy raised his small hand in a tentative wave, and I felt something shift inside my chest. For 43 years, I'd lived for myself alone, making decisions based on survival and self-interest. But now, for the first time, I had something worth dying for. "You ready, Cross?" Blackwood called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "Been ready for 20 years?" I replied. The rules were simple, established by generations of men who had settled their differences with lead and powder. We would walk toward each other until one of us decided the distance was right, then draw and fire. The last man standing would be the winner, and the dead would have no say in what came after. We began walking. My mind was calm, focused, my breathing steady and controlled. This was what I'd been born for, not the killing, but the moment of absolute clarity that came just before violence erupted. Time seemed to slow, and I became aware of everything. The creak of leather, the whisper of wind through the buildings, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. 30 yards. 25. 20. Blackwood was good. I could see it in the way he moved, the confidence in his stride. This wasn't a man who had built his reputation on luck or intimidation alone. He was a genuine gunfighter, fast and accurate, with the kind of cold nerve that kept a man alive in a profession where most died young. 15 yards. 10. I could see Blackwood's eyes now, could read the calculation there. The man was waiting for the perfect moment, the instant when distance and angle and opportunity all aligned. He was a professional, and professionals didn't take unnecessary risks. But I wasn't a professional anymore. I was something more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. 8 yards. Blackwood's hand moved first, a blur of motion that would have been impressive under any other circumstances. His gun cleared leather cleanly, the barrel coming up in a smooth arc that spoke of countless hours of practice. But I was faster. My draw was a thing of beauty and terror, honed by years of necessity and perfected by natural talent. The Colt seemed to appear in my hand as if by magic, and my first shot thundered across the street before Blackwood's gun had fully cleared its holster. The bullet took Blackwood high in the chest, spinning him around and sending his unfired weapon flying into the dust. He staggered, tried to stay upright, then collapsed to his knees with blood spreading across his white shirt. I walked toward him, my gun still drawn, ready to fire again if necessary. But as I got closer, I could see that it wouldn't be needed. Blackwood's eyes were already glazing over, his breathing shallow and labored. "The papers," I said quietly. "Where are the real papers?" Blackwood coughed, blood speckling his lips. "Safe in my office, along with a dozen others just like them. And your men will scatter like rats when they hear I'm dead. No loyalty without money to pay for it." I knelt beside the dying man. "Why the stones? Why their land?" Blackwood's laugh was a wet, rattling sound. "Water rights, worth a fortune when the railroad comes through. Daniel's father knew it too. That's why he never would sell. So you forged the debt papers. Easiest way to take what I wanted. Would have worked too if not for you." Blackwood's eyes focused on me with effort. "Who are you really, Cross? What made you care about strangers?" I thought about the question as Blackwood's breathing grew more labored. What had made me care? Was it Billy's innocent trust? Sarah's desperate courage? Daniel's willingness to sacrifice everything for his family? Or was it something simpler? The recognition that I'd spent my entire life running from connection, from responsibility, from the possibility of being hurt again? Maybe caring about the stones wasn't about them at all. Maybe it was about finally admitting that a life lived in isolation wasn't really living at all. "I guess I got tired of being alone," I said finally. But Blackwood was beyond hearing. His eyes had closed and his breathing had stopped, leaving only the morning wind to disturb the silence. I stood slowly, holstering my gun, and turned to face the crowd that had gathered. Some faces showed relief, others fear, and a few displayed the kind of calculating look that suggested they were already wondering how to profit from Blackwood's death. But the only faces that mattered were the three standing in front of Doc Harrison's office. Daniel and Sarah were holding each other, tears streaming down their faces, while Billy had broken free and was running toward me as fast as his little legs could carry him. I caught the boy in my arms, lifting him high and spinning him around as Billy laughed with pure, uncomplicated joy. It was a sound that cut through the morning air like sunlight through clouds, washing away the darkness of violence and death. "Is it over?" Sarah asked as she and Daniel approached. Are we really safe? It's over, I confirmed. Blackwood's men will be long gone by noon, and without him backing them up, those forged papers aren't worth the ink they're printed on. Sheriff Williams approached, his expression unreadable. That was some shooting, Jaxon. Clean and legal, no question about it. But I have to ask, what happens now? I looked down at Billy, who was still clinging to me with absolute trust. Then at Daniel and Sarah, who were looking at me with something that might have been hope. Now we go home, I said simply. The ride back to my cabin was different from any journey I'd ever taken. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't traveling alone. Daniel rode beside me despite his injuries, while Sarah held Billy in front of her on her horse. We talked as we rode, about the ranch they would rebuild, about the life they would create, about the future that had seemed impossible just hours before. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked as we approached my property. "Will you stay in Cedar Falls?" I had been thinking about that question all morning. My cabin suddenly seemed small and empty, a place built for solitude rather than connection. But the stone ranch, once it was rebuilt, would need help. There would be cattle to tend, fences to mend, and 1,000 other tasks that required strong backs and willing hands. "I was thinking," I said carefully, "that you folks might need a partner, someone to help get the ranch back on its feet." Daniel's face lit up. "You mean it? You'd want to work with us?" "I mean it," I replied, "if you'll have me." The answer came not from Daniel or Sarah, but from Billy, who reached out from his mother's arms and grabbed my hand with both of his tiny ones. "Jaxon, stay," the boy said clearly. The first words anyone had heard him speak. "Jaxon, stay." And in that moment, I understood that I'd found something I'd been searching for my entire life without even knowing it. Not just a family, but a place to belong. Not just a home, but a reason to build one. 3 months later, the stone ranch was thriving again. The main house had been rebuilt, the fences repaired, and the cattle were growing fat on the rich grass that grew near the stream. I had built my own small house on the property, close enough to help when needed, far enough away to maintain my independence. But most evenings found me at the main house, sharing dinner with Daniel and Sarah, teaching Billy to whittle, and listening to the sounds of a family at peace. The boy had grown stronger and happier, his traumatic memories fading as new, better ones took their place. The town of Cedar Falls had changed too. With Blackwood gone, other families had come forward with stories of forged debts and stolen land. Sheriff Williams, emboldened by my example, had begun investigating the claims and returning property to its rightful owners. The town was healing, just like the Stone family. On this particular evening, as autumn painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I sat on the porch of the main house with Billy on my lap. The boy was practicing his letters, carefully tracing them in the dirt with a stick. "What's that one?" I asked, pointing to a crooked letter. "S," Billy said proudly. "For Mama." "And that one?" "D for Papa." "And this one?" Billy grinned up at me. "J for Jaxon. My Jaxon." I felt my throat tighten with emotion. "That's right, little man. Your Jaxon." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Daniel and Sarah joined us on the porch. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the night settle over our land, our home, our family. "You know," Daniel said eventually, "I never did thank you properly for what you did." "No need," I replied. "You gave me something I didn't even know I was missing." "What's that?" I looked down at Billy, who had fallen asleep against my chest, then at Daniel and Sarah, who were holding hands and watching their son with infinite tenderness. "A reason to stop running," I said simply. And as the night deepened around us, Jaxon Cross, the lonely cowboy who had spent 43 years searching for a place to belong, finally understood what it meant to be home. The boy who had been tied to a fence post like an unwanted burden was now surrounded by love and safety. The parents who had been torn apart by greed and violence were together again, stronger than ever. And the man who had saved them all had discovered that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't facing down a gunfighter in the street. Sometimes it's simply choosing to care. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, its voice carrying across the prairie like a song of freedom. But I no longer envied its solitude. I had found something better than freedom. I had found family, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.